You know that feeling when you're completely alone somewhere and suddenly every hair on your arm stands straight up? That creeping awareness that makes you freeze mid-step and hold your breath, straining to hear something you can't quite identify? I used to think that was just paranoia, the overactive imagination of someone who spent too much time in isolated places. Now I know better. Now I understand that our bodies sometimes pick up on things our conscious minds refuse to accept, and sometimes what's out there watching you is something that shouldn't exist. I need to tell this story from the beginning, even though part of me still can't believe it happened. My name is Margaret Chen, and I've been hiking and photographing wildlife in these forests for nearly 25 years. Started when I was barely 18, fresh out of high school, tagging along on camping trips with my grandmother, who knew every trail, every stream, every hidden meadow worth knowing in these parts. The Allegheny National Forest became my second home, and after Grandma passed, I kept coming back year after year, learning the land the way she had taught me. These aren't your well-maintained state park trails with mile markers and picnic benches every quarter mile. I'm talking about the deep backcountry, places where you can hike for 3 days without seeing another human being, where the tree canopy is so thick that noon looks like twilight, and where the nearest paved road is a brutal 6-hour trek through terrain that would break most casual hikers. I thought I knew these woods better than I knew my own apartment in Pittsburgh. I was wrong about that, as it turns out. Dead wrong. It started last autumn, sometime around mid-September, when reports began filtering through the small communities at the forest's edge about something destroying campsites in the remote northern sections. Not the usual bear damage where they tear into coolers and scatter garbage looking for food. This was different. This was violent in a way that didn't make sense. Tents shredded into ribbons, camp chairs twisted into unrecognizable shapes, and most disturbing of all, deep gouges carved into tree trunks at heights that would have required a ladder to reach. The Forest Service sent rangers to investigate, and the official word came back that it was probably a particularly aggressive black bear, maybe one that had been fed by careless campers and lost its fear of humans. Some folks whispered about a mountain lion, though cats that size are rare this far east, and they don't typically trash campsites like they're throwing a tantrum. The explanations didn't satisfy anyone who actually looked at the damage, but what else could anyone say? What other explanation made any kind of sense? I'd been finding strange tracks for weeks before I decided to set up my first camera. They appeared after heavy rains, preserved in the muddy sections of game trails where the soil was soft enough to hold an impression. At first glance, they almost looked like bear prints, which would have been unremarkable in this area. But something about them nagged at me every time I found a new set. They were too elongated, too narrow through the arch, and they appeared in patterns that suggested bipedal locomotion rather than the four-footed amble of a bear. The prints were enormous. I measured one set near a creek crossing, and the largest print was 17 inches from heel to toe and nearly 7 inches across at its widest point. I've seen plenty of bear tracks in my time, and even the biggest male black bear doesn't leave prints that dwarf a size 13 boot. More troubling was the stride length. Whatever made these tracks was covering ground in steps that would have had me jogging to keep pace, and it was walking in remarkably straight lines, not the meandering path a foraging bear would take. Then there were the claw marks. I found them on mature hemlock trees near several of the destroyed campsites, always in the same pattern. Vertical gouges running down the bark, starting at heights of 8 or 9 feet and extending down to roughly shoulder level. They weren't the random scratches of a bear marking territory or sharpening its claws. These looked deliberate, almost artistic in their precision, like something was demonstrating what it could do, or perhaps sending a message I didn't yet understand. One morning in late September, I was checking a trail camera I'd placed near a salt lick when I stumbled across a fresh set of those distinctive tracks. They led directly toward a clearing I'd been monitoring for years, a natural opening in the forest canopy, where a rocky outcrop created a small amphitheater of sorts, with a shallow cave visible at the base of a limestone cliff. I'd photographed everything from white-tailed deer to the occasional black bear in that clearing, and it was one of my favorite spots in the entire forest. But that morning, approaching the clearing felt different. The usual symphony of forest sounds was missing. No chickadees calling from the understory, no squirrels chattering territorial warnings, no crows cawing from the treetops. Even the insects seemed to have gone silent. The forest was holding its breath, waiting for something, and the weight of that silence pressed down on me like a physical force. That's when I decided to set up a dedicated surveillance camera. I'd been using trail cameras for wildlife photography for years. Nothing fancy, just reliable units that could capture decent images and short video clips when the motion sensor triggered. If something unusual was moving through the area on a regular basis, I wanted documentation. Maybe I'd finally get clear footage of whatever bear was causing all the trouble, or confirm the presence of a mountain lion that had wandered into the territory. I selected a spot about 25 yards from the edge of the clearing, mounting my camera on a sturdy beech tree that would hold it steady through wind and weather. The angle gave me an unobstructed view of the open area and the mouth of that shallow cave. I positioned the camera high enough that a curious deer wouldn't knock it askew, but low enough to capture anything walking through at ground level. The location felt right, remote enough that I wouldn't have to worry about other hikers discovering my equipment, but positioned along what appeared to be a natural wildlife corridor with game trails converging from multiple directions. I noted the date and time in the small notebook I always carried, September 23rd, around 2:30 in the afternoon. The plan was simple. Let the camera run for a week, then hike back to check what it had recorded. I'd done this routine countless times before, usually ending up with hundreds of photos of deer at dawn and dusk, the occasional wild turkey, and maybe a raccoon or a possum making its nightly rounds. Walking back to where I'd parked my Subaru, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The sensation was like an itch I couldn't scratch, a persistent awareness that something was tracking my progress through the trees. I stopped twice and turned to scan the forest behind me, but I never saw anything that would explain the feeling. Just shadows and tree trunks and the filtered afternoon light slanting through the canopy. Still, I found myself walking faster than usual, and I was genuinely relieved when I finally reached my car. The week passed with agonizing slowness. I went through my normal routines, working my shifts at the veterinary clinic, where I'd been employed for the past 15 years, coming home to my small apartment, trying to focus on television shows and books and anything that would distract me from thinking about that camera sitting in the forest, recording whatever passed through its field of view. Part of me expected to find nothing more exciting than the usual wildlife photos. But another part of me, the part that had seen those massive tracks and inexplicable claw marks, was hoping for something that would finally provide answers. September 30th arrived, and I made the long drive and longer hike back to the clearing. The camera was exactly where I'd left it, undisturbed, the small indicator light blinking to show the battery was still good and the memory card still had space. I retrieved the SD card and headed home, eager to see what the week had captured. That evening, I loaded the images onto my laptop and began scrolling through the results. The first several days showed the expected parade of forest wildlife. Deer moving through at dawn, a doe with twin fawns browsing on the vegetation at the clearing's edge, squirrels and chipmunks triggering the motion sensor with their constant activity. One nice shot of a red fox trotting through with something small and unfortunate in its mouth. Nothing out of the ordinary for the first 5 days. Then I reached the images from the 6th night. The timestamp showed 3:14 in the morning when the camera first triggered. The initial photo was dark, the clearing illuminated only by the camera's infrared flash, but something large was moving at the far edge of the frame. The second photo, captured 3 seconds later, showed it more clearly, and what I saw made my blood run cold. Whatever it wasn't a bear. The figure stood fully upright, clearly bipedal and impossibly tall. Taller than any human being I'd ever encountered, and I'd met some very tall people in my life. The body proportions were wrong for a person, though. The shoulders were too broad, the torso too thick and barrel-shaped, the arms too long for the overall frame. The entire figure was covered in what appeared to be dense, dark fur or hair, and it moved across the clearing with a fluid, purposeful stride that suggested both power and intelligence. But the third photo was what truly shattered my understanding of the world. The creature had moved closer to the camera, close enough that I could make out more details in the infrared image. It wasn't just passing through the clearing on some random nocturnal errand. It was looking directly at my camera. The flash had reflected off 2 eyes, giving them an eerie, luminescent quality. And the angle of the head made it absolutely clear that the creature had noticed my equipment and was actively examining it. The fourth and final photo in that sequence showed the empty clearing again. Whatever it was had moved on, but not before taking a long, deliberate look at my surveillance setup. I stared at those images for hours that night. I zoomed in until the pixels became meaningless blurs, adjusted brightness and contrast and every other setting my photo software offered, desperately trying to convince myself I was looking at something normal. Maybe it was just a bear standing on its hind legs, curious about an unfamiliar object in its territory. Maybe the camera angle and the harsh infrared lighting were playing tricks, making something ordinary appear strange and threatening. I called my friend Denise around midnight, unable to sit alone with what I was seeing. Denise and I had known each other since veterinary school, and she'd always been the skeptical one, the pragmatist who dismissed anything that couldn't be proven through empirical observation. I thought maybe she could talk me down, explain away what I was looking at, restore my faith in a rational universe where impossible things didn't walk through mountain clearings at 3 in the morning. But when I showed her the photos over video chat, her usual confident dismissiveness faltered. She kept asking me to zoom in, to adjust the angle, to show her the sequence again. After 20 minutes of silent examination, she finally said the words I'd been dreading. "Maggie, I don't know what that is. I've never seen anything like it." We stayed on the call for another hour, going through possible explanations. A person in a costume seemed unlikely given the remote location and the time of night. A bear standing upright didn't account for the proportions or the way the figure was clearly walking across the clearing rather than simply rearing up to sniff the air. Some kind of elaborate hoax involving my camera equipment seemed paranoid and nonsensical. By the time we hung up, neither of us had found an explanation that made sense, and Denise made me promise to be careful if I went back to that area. But the more I examined those photos, the more certain I became that I'd captured something I couldn't explain. The proportions were entirely wrong for any bear I'd ever seen or read about. Bears don't walk across clearings on 2 legs like they're out for a midnight stroll. The stride length visible between the sequential photos suggested something with much longer legs than any known North American mammal. And that final image, with those eyes staring directly into the camera lens, suggested a kind of awareness that went far beyond simple animal curiosity. I found myself going back to that 4th photo again and again, drawn to those eyes despite my fear. What was behind them? What kind of mind was capable of recognizing a trail camera for what it was, approaching to investigate rather than fleeing or ignoring it? The questions multiplied the longer I stared, and the answers remained frustratingly out of reach. Around 4 in the morning, I finally forced myself to step away from the computer. My eyes were burning from hours of staring at the screen, and my coffee had long since gone cold. I walked to my window and looked out at the quiet street below, at the familiar shapes of parked cars and street lamps, and the ordinary world that suddenly seemed less certain than it had been 24 hours earlier. Somewhere out there, in the darkness of the mountains I'd thought I knew, something was awake. Something that had looked at my camera and known what it was. Something that might still be thinking about the strange device it had found mounted on a tree, and about the human who had put it there. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my apartment, with all the lights on, drinking cup after cup of coffee, cycling through those 4 photos again and again, and trying to make sense of what I'd documented. I kept thinking about those eyes looking directly at the camera, and I found myself wondering what kind of intelligence might be behind them. Most animals that trigger trail cameras either ignore the equipment entirely or get spooked by the flash and flee. This thing had been curious enough to approach and investigate. It had demonstrated awareness that it was being watched and had chosen to examine the watcher. By morning, I'd made a decision that I would later come to regret. I needed better footage, more angles, clearer images. If something that unusual was regularly moving through the area, I wanted to document it properly. I wanted proof that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. I spent the next day gathering equipment from my apartment and making a trip to the outdoor supply store on the edge of town. I had 2 additional trail cameras in storage, older models, but still perfectly functional. I bought extra batteries, additional memory cards, and a spray bottle of scent eliminator to mask my presence while setting up the expanded surveillance network. The plan was to create a triangle formation around my original camera position, establishing overlapping fields of view that would capture anything moving through the clearing from multiple angles. I'd put one camera near the cave entrance, another on the opposite side of the clearing, and keep my original camera in its current position. With 3 different viewpoints, I'd be able to track movement patterns and gather much more comprehensive documentation of whatever was visiting the area. 2 days later, I hiked back into the forest with my expanded camera setup. The morning was crisp and clear, the kind of perfect autumn day that usually made me grateful to be alive and able to spend time in places like this. But as soon as I approached the clearing, something felt wrong. The forest was too quiet again, that same oppressive silence I'd experienced on my first visit after finding those tracks. No bird song, no scampering of small animals through the leaf litter, no insect sounds, despite the warmth of the day. The silence felt like a held breath, like the entire forest was waiting to see what I would do next. Setting up the first additional camera took longer than I'd anticipated. I wanted the angle to be perfect, capturing anything that approached the cave entrance from inside the clearing. Finding a tree with the right position and clear line of sight required more trial and error than I would have liked, and the whole time I worked, I couldn't shake the sensation of being observed. Every few minutes I'd stop what I was doing and slowly scan the tree line around the clearing, searching for any sign of movement or any shape that didn't belong. I never saw anything obvious, but the feeling persisted, that crawling awareness between my shoulder blades that told me I wasn't alone. The second camera went up on the far side of the clearing, angled to capture anything moving along the main game trail that led down from the ridge to the north. This position would provide a side view to complement the frontal angle of my original camera. With all 3 units running, I'd have comprehensive coverage of the clearing and most of the approaches to it. If anything larger than a rabbit moved through the area, I'd have footage from multiple perspectives. It was while positioning my third camera that I found the first fresh footprint. I was searching for the ideal mounting spot on a mature oak tree when I noticed the ground nearby was softer than the surrounding area. A slight depression had collected moisture from recent rains, creating a perfect medium for preserving impressions in the soil. And there, clear as if it had been deliberately placed for me to find, was one of those massive tracks I'd been documenting around the destroyed campsites. This print was even clearer than any I'd seen before, showing individual toe impressions and what looked like the texture of thick, calloused skin across the heel and ball of the foot. The print was fresh. Couldn't have been more than a day old based on how crisp the edges were. But what truly unsettled me was the location. The footprint was positioned right beside where I'd been kneeling while working on the camera mount, close enough that whatever made it could have reached out and touched me while I focused on my task. The realization sent a chill cascading down my spine that had nothing to do with the autumn air. I began searching the area more carefully and found 2 more prints, both leading away from the oak tree toward the cave entrance. Whatever had been watching me work had eventually moved off in that direction, but not before getting close enough to study me at almost touching distance. The thought that I might not be alone in the forest right now, that something might be observing me at this very moment from just inside the tree line, was both terrifying and strangely exhilarating. I finished the camera setup as quickly as I could manage, double-checking that each unit was properly mounted and functioning before hurrying away from the clearing. All 3 cameras showed solid battery levels and clear memory card indicators. The overlapping coverage looked good on paper, but I was suddenly much less confident about the wisdom of what I was doing. Walking back toward my car, I kept looking over my shoulder. The sensation of being watched was stronger than ever, and I found myself moving faster than I normally would on the steep root-crossed terrain. Several times I was certain I heard something moving parallel to my path through the trees, staying just out of sight but matching my pace with disturbing precision. At one point, I stopped completely and held my breath, listening. For perhaps 10 seconds, everything was silent. Then I heard what sounded like a heavy branch snapping somewhere behind me, followed by the rustle of something large moving through thick undergrowth. When I spun around, I couldn't see anything, but the section of forest in that direction had gone completely silent, as if everything living had suddenly fled or frozen in place. I didn't run back to my car. That would have felt too much like admitting defeat, acknowledging that I was genuinely frightened of something I still couldn't see or identify. But I definitely walked faster than normal, and I was breathing hard by the time I reached the trailhead and saw my dusty Subaru waiting where I'd left it. That night, I couldn't focus on anything. I tried to eat dinner, but the food tasted like cardboard. I tried to watch television, but couldn't follow even the simplest plotline. I kept thinking about that fresh footprint right next to where I'd been working, evidence that something had approached to within arm's reach while I was obliviously adjusting camera angles. How long had it been watching me? Had it been there the entire time, staying just hidden enough to remain undetected? The idea that I'd been observed throughout my visit to the clearing, perhaps from only a few dozen yards away, was deeply and profoundly unsettling. 3 days later, I decided to check my cameras early. The original plan had been to wait a full week, give the area time to return to normal after my intrusion. But curiosity overpowered caution. I needed to see what the expanded setup had recorded. I needed to know if the creature from my first footage had returned. The hike back to the clearing was uneventful until I got close to my camera positions. That's when I realized something had gone terribly wrong. The morning had started normally enough. I'd packed a light day bag with water and snacks, told myself this was just a routine camera check like dozens I'd done before, tried to ignore the nervous flutter in my stomach that had nothing to do with hunger. The drive to the trailhead took about 40 minutes, winding through small towns that were just beginning to show signs of autumn tourism. Leaf peepers from the cities coming to see the colors and eat at the small diners that dotted the main roads. I parked in my usual spot, a small pull-off at the end of a gravel road that most people drove right past without noticing. The morning air was cool and sharp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke from some unseen chimney. I shouldered my pack and started up the trail, telling myself that everything would be normal, that the cameras would show nothing unusual, that my fears were overblown and my imagination was running wild. The first hour of hiking passed without incident. I moved at my usual pace, stopping occasionally to photograph interesting fungal growths or to check the GPS coordinates on my phone. The forest seemed normal, full of the expected autumn sounds and movements. Squirrels gathering acorns, woodpeckers hammering at dead trees, the occasional flash of a white-tailed deer bounding away through the underbrush. Then I crossed into what I'd come to think of as the quiet zone, the area surrounding the clearing where normal forest sounds seemed to fade away. The transition wasn't gradual. One moment, I was walking through a normal forest. The next, I was surrounded by that oppressive silence that had become so familiar. My footsteps seemed unnaturally loud on the leaf-covered trail, and I found myself walking more carefully, trying to minimize the sound of my passage. The first camera I checked, the one I'd mounted near the cave entrance, was gone. Not knocked down by weather or damaged by a falling branch, gone. The mounting strap I'd used to secure it to the tree had been broken or cut, and the camera itself had been completely removed. I searched the area around the tree for 20 minutes, looking under every bush and behind every rock, but I couldn't find any trace of my equipment. The second additional camera, positioned on the far side of the clearing, was still in place, but something had changed its orientation. Instead of pointing toward the center of the clearing as I'd intended, the camera was now aimed back toward the main trail, the direction I always approached from. The unit was still functional, still securely mounted, but it had been deliberately repositioned to monitor my arrival route rather than the clearing itself. Someone, or something, had figured out where I came from and adjusted my equipment to watch for my return. My original camera remained in its initial position, but when I approached to examine it, I could see large, smudged prints on the lens housing, not human fingerprints. These were much larger, with a different ridge pattern, and they suggested that something with enormous hands had picked up the camera and examined it closely before replacing it in its mount. Walking around the clearing, I found fresh footprints everywhere. The recent rains had left the ground soft, and the tracks were clear and numerous. Whatever had visited had spent considerable time in the area, approaching each camera location and systematically studying my surveillance equipment. The most disturbing discovery was a set of prints that formed a complete circuit around the clearing, staying just inside the tree line. Something had walked the entire perimeter, probably while I wasn't present, checking each camera position from multiple angles. The tracks suggested a methodical, almost scientific approach to investigating my setup. This wasn't random animal curiosity. This was something that understood what cameras were for, something that had deliberately interfered with my monitoring operation. The realization that the creature had not only found my cameras, but had actively manipulated them and stolen one was profoundly disturbing. It demonstrated a level of intelligence and intentionality that made me question everything I thought I knew about what was living in these forests. Standing in the middle of that clearing, surrounded by evidence that something had been systematically examining my equipment, I felt more vulnerable and exposed than I'd ever felt in my life. Whatever was out there knew I was watching it, and it was watching me right back. I retrieved the memory cards from my 2 remaining cameras and left the clearing, moving faster than I normally would on the rough terrain. Several times I thought I heard movement keeping pace with me through the dense trees, but I never saw anything definitive. The forest remained unnaturally quiet until I was nearly back to the trailhead, when the normal sounds of birds and insects suddenly resumed, as if some invisible boundary had been crossed. That evening, I loaded the memory cards and discovered that my worst suspicions were justified. The cameras had captured extensive footage of the creature examining my equipment and moving around the clearing. The images were clearer than my first batch, showing more detail of what I was dealing with, and what they showed made my hands shake as I scrolled through them. The creature was definitely bipedal, definitely intelligent, and definitely much larger than any known animal in the region. The footage showed it approaching each camera location, spending several minutes examining each setup with what appeared to be careful, systematic attention. In one particularly striking image, the creature was looking directly into my original camera lens from just a few feet away, close enough that I could make out the texture of its facial features and the glint of reflected infrared light in its deep-set eyes. What struck me most forcefully was the deliberate nature of its actions. This wasn't random behavior triggered by novelty or territorial instinct. The creature had methodically investigated each camera, figured out how to adjust their positions, and removed one entirely. The intelligence displayed in the footage was unmistakable and deeply troubling, but the most disturbing image was the last one captured before my arrival to check the cameras. The timestamp showed it was taken barely 2 hours before I reached the clearing. The creature was standing at the edge of the tree line, partially concealed behind a massive hemlock trunk, and appeared to be watching the trail I would be approaching on. It had been waiting for me. That night, I barely slept at all. Every sound outside my apartment, the wind rattling the old windows, a car passing on the street below, the settling creaks of the aging building, made me flinch and reach for the hunting knife I'd placed on my nightstand. I kept thinking about that final image, the way the creature had positioned itself to observe my approach. Had it seen me coming and retreated before I arrived? Or had it stayed hidden somewhere nearby, watching me the entire time I was examining my cameras and searching for the missing equipment? The next morning, I made a decision that went against every instinct, telling me to stay far away from that clearing and everything associated with it. If the creature was as intelligent as it appeared to be, perhaps I could observe its behavior directly rather than relying on trail cameras that it could easily avoid or manipulate. Against every warning my rational mind was screaming at me, I decided to spend a night in the forest near the clearing. I spent the afternoon preparing for an overnight camping trip. I packed light, just a small 2-person tent, a sleeping bag rated for cold weather, basic food and water for one night, and the essentials for emergency situations. I also brought a powerful LED flashlight with fresh batteries and the 12-gauge shotgun I kept for bear encounters, though I sincerely hoped I wouldn't need to use either one. The plan was to set up camp about 200 yards from the clearing, in a position that would give me a clear view of the area while keeping me out of the immediate vicinity of whatever was happening there. The hike back to the area that evening felt fundamentally different from all my previous trips. The forest seemed more alive somehow, humming with activity and awareness that I'd somehow never noticed before. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every crack of a twig, every bird call made me hyper-aware of how much was happening around me at any given moment. The wilderness I thought I knew intimately had become strange and threatening, full of sounds and movements that suddenly seemed laden with significance I couldn't quite interpret. I thought about turning back at least a dozen times during that hike. Every instinct honed by years of wilderness experience was screaming at me that this was a bad idea, that I was making a mistake I might not survive. But something else, some mixture of curiosity and stubbornness and maybe a little foolish pride, kept my feet moving forward on the trail. My grandmother would have called it mulishness. She used to say I inherited it from her, that same inability to let go of a question once it had lodged itself in my brain. "Maggie," she'd say, "you're going to curiosity yourself into real trouble someday." I used to laugh when she said that. I wasn't laughing anymore. The late afternoon light filtered through the canopy in golden shafts, beautiful and unsettling at the same time. Every shadow seemed deeper than it should be, every patch of undergrowth potentially hiding something that watched my approach. I found myself stopping frequently to listen, straining to hear anything that might indicate I wasn't alone, but the forest gave nothing away. I found a good camping spot on a small rise overlooking the clearing. The position gave me a clear line of sight to the cave entrance and most of the open area, while keeping me elevated and partially concealed behind a cluster of moss-covered boulders. I set up my tent with practiced efficiency and settled in to wait for darkness. The sun set around 7:45 and full darkness fell about an hour later. The autumn nights come early and cold in the Alleghenies, and I was grateful for the warm sleeping bag and the extra layers I'd brought. I positioned myself outside the tent with my back against one of the boulders, the shotgun across my knees, and began my vigil. For the first couple of hours, everything seemed normal. I heard the usual nocturnal sounds. Great horned owls calling their territorial claims, small animals moving through the undergrowth on their nightly rounds, the distant yipping of coyotes somewhere deeper in the forest. The clearing below remained empty and still, illuminated by enough starlight that I could make out general shapes and movement. Around 10:15, things began to change. The normal night sounds started to fade one by one, like someone slowly turning down the volume on a radio. Within maybe 15 minutes, the forest had become almost completely silent. No owl calls, no rustling of small animals, no insect chorus. The quiet was so profound that I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. It felt unnatural, wrong, like the world was holding its breath in anticipation of something terrible. That's when I heard the footsteps. They started somewhere to my right, moving slowly through the forest in the direction of the clearing below. The sound was unmistakable, something large walking on two legs, placing each foot with deliberate care. The steps were too heavy and too widely spaced to be human, and they had a rhythm that seemed almost hypnotic, a slow, measured cadence that spoke of patience and purpose. I strained to see movement in the darkness below, but whatever was making those footsteps stayed hidden in the tree line around the clearing. For nearly an hour, I could hear it moving around the perimeter of the open area, sometimes stopping for long stretches, sometimes advancing a few steps before pausing again. It seemed to be surveying the clearing, checking for any changes since its last visit. Around midnight, the footsteps stopped completely. The forest remained silent for another 30 minutes, and I began to hope that whatever had been down there had moved on, satisfied with its patrol. I was wrong about that. The first indication that I was no longer alone on the rise came as the sound of something large moving through the trees directly behind my camping position. Not the careful, measured footsteps I'd been hearing from the clearing, but faster movement through thick brush, like something was approaching my location from a completely different direction. I turned around slowly, trying not to make any sudden movements that might attract attention or provoke a response. The forest behind me was completely dark, and I couldn't make out any specific shapes or movement, but I could hear something out there, staying just beyond the reach of my vision, circling around my campsite. Then I heard footsteps on my left side, moving parallel to the rise, and more movement on my right. The realization hit me like a physical blow. There wasn't just one creature out there. Multiple somethings were moving around my camping spot, staying hidden in the darkness, but making no effort to conceal the sounds of their approach. The feeling of being surrounded was overwhelming. I'd positioned myself on the rise, thinking it would give me a tactical advantage, a clear view of the area I wanted to observe. Instead, I'd put myself in a spot where I could be approached from multiple directions without any real warning or opportunity to retreat. For the next 2 hours, I sat motionless against the boulder, the shotgun raised and ready, listening to movement all around my position. Sometimes the sounds would fade away completely, making me think they'd finally lost interest and moved on. Then I'd hear a branch snap or the rustle of something shifting its weight, and I'd realize they were still there, still watching, still waiting. The most unsettling aspect was how intelligent their movement seemed. They never came close enough for me to see them clearly, but they were obviously aware of exactly where I was. Several times I heard what sounded like soft vocalizations, Low rumbling sounds that seemed to carry meaning, as if they were communicating with each other about the strange visitor in their territory. Around 3 in the morning, everything went quiet again. The sudden absence of movement and sound was almost as unnerving as the activity had been. I waited another hour before allowing myself to relax even slightly, thinking they might have finally moved on. I was wrong about that too. Just before dawn, I dozed off for a few minutes while leaning against the cold boulder. Exhaustion had finally overcome fear, and my eyes closed without my permission. I woke up when I heard my tent zipper being opened. The sound was absolutely unmistakable, that distinctive metallic rasp of a zipper being slowly, carefully pulled down. I opened my eyes and looked toward my tent, positioned about 10 feet to my left. In the dim, pre-dawn light, gray and formless and heavy with mist, I could see a large, dark shape crouched next to the tent entrance, manipulating the zipper with what appeared to be remarkable dexterity. I held my breath and remained completely motionless, every muscle frozen, not wanting to attract the attention of whatever was investigating my camping gear. My hands tightened on the shotgun, but I didn't raise it, didn't move, didn't even blink. Some deep survival instinct was telling me that drawing attention to myself right now would be catastrophically stupid. The creature spent several minutes examining the inside of my tent, reaching in and moving things around quietly and carefully. At one point, it pulled out my sleeping bag and seemed to be feeling the material, perhaps trying to understand what it was made of or what purpose it served. The level of curiosity and methodical investigation was remarkable to witness, even through the lens of my terror. When it finished with the tent, the creature moved over to my backpack, which I'd left on the ground near my camping spot. Again, it spent several minutes going through the contents, removing items one by one, examining them with apparent fascination, then putting them back roughly where they'd been. A water bottle, a package of trail mix, my first aid kit. Each object received careful scrutiny before being replaced. Throughout this entire investigation, the creature remained just at the edge of my peripheral vision. I could see its general shape and estimate its size, definitely much larger than any human, covered in dark fur or hair that seemed to absorb the growing dawn light. But I couldn't make out specific details of its face or hands. It moved with a fluid, almost graceful economy of motion that suggested tremendous physical power held carefully in check. The most unnerving thing was how quietly it moved. Despite its obvious size and mass, it made almost no sound as it examined my equipment. The only noises were the occasional soft rustle of nylon fabric and that initial metallic whisper of the tent zipper. For something so large, it had an almost supernatural ability to move without disturbing its environment. After perhaps 20 minutes, the creature seemed to lose interest in my camping gear. It straightened up, a movement that made me acutely aware of just how tall it actually was, and moved away from my campsite, heading back toward the tree line. I lost sight of it in the growing dawn light and the mist that hung low between the trees. I remained absolutely motionless for another full hour, listening for any indication that it or others might still be in the area. As full daylight finally arrived and the mist began to burn off, I felt safe enough to move around and assess what had happened. Examining my tent and backpack, I was struck by how carefully everything had been handled. Nothing was damaged or destroyed. Items had been moved around and examined with obvious thoroughness, but everything had been put back more or less where it belonged. The creature had shown remarkable restraint and what could only be described as curiosity rather than aggression. It could easily have destroyed my equipment or attacked me while I dozed against that boulder. Instead, it had conducted what seemed like a careful, almost scientific investigation of my presence in its territory. Looking around the camping area in daylight, I found evidence that my nocturnal visitors had been even more numerous than I'd realized. Footprints were everywhere, around my tent, near my backpack, and in a wide circle encompassing my entire camping spot. The prints showed at least 3 distinct individuals, all of enormous size, but with subtle variations in shape and depth that suggested different ages or perhaps different genders. But the most disturbing discovery was waiting for me at my car. I had parked nearly half a mile from my camping spot, thinking the distance would keep my vehicle separate from whatever activity might occur near the clearing. The hike back to the trailhead took longer than usual because my legs felt weak and rubbery, still trembling from the night's experiences. When I finally reached my Subaru, I stopped dead in my tracks. Large handprints covered the driver's side door and window, much larger than human hands, showing the same distinctive pattern I'd seen on my trail camera. Whatever had visited my campsite had also found my car and examined it thoroughly. The prints suggested they'd tested the door handles and pressed against the windows, probably trying to understand what the vehicle was and how it worked. Looking more closely, I found additional prints on the hood and along both sides of the car. There were footprints in the soft earth around the parking area, showing that at least 2 individuals had spent considerable time investigating my vehicle. They knew where I'd come from, where I'd camped, and how I planned to leave the area. The level of intelligence and coordination required for that kind of comprehensive surveillance was deeply, profoundly disturbing. Standing next to my car that morning, looking at those massive handprints on the dusty window glass, I felt more vulnerable and exposed than I had at any point in my life. These creatures weren't just randomly moving through their territory anymore. They were actively studying me, learning my patterns and habits, demonstrating a level of intelligence that made them genuinely dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with physical strength. I loaded my gear into the car and drove home as quickly as the winding mountain roads would allow, desperate to put distance between myself and an area where I was clearly outmatched and completely out of my depth. But the experience had fundamentally changed my understanding of those forests I'd loved for so many years. I could no longer think of them as familiar wilderness that I understood and could navigate safely. They were home to something I didn't understand, something that was now very much aware of my existence. That evening, I did something I'd never done before. I spent hours researching what I'd experienced online, typing search terms I would have mocked a week earlier into multiple browsers, and following links deep into corners of the internet I'd never known existed. I'd always been skeptical of stories about unknown creatures in the wilderness, dismissing them as the products of overactive imaginations or deliberate hoaxes designed to generate attention or revenue. But after what I'd witnessed, I was willing to consider possibilities I'd never entertained before. The sheer volume of information was overwhelming. Forums dedicated to cryptid sightings, websites cataloging eyewitness accounts, academic papers discussing the psychology of wilderness encounters, even scientific analyses of alleged evidence that had been collected over the decades. I fell down a rabbit hole that stretched on for hours, reading account after account from people who claimed to have seen exactly what I'd seen, experienced exactly what I'd experienced. Some of the accounts were clearly fabricated, too neat and polished to be genuine, hitting all the expected beats of a campfire story designed for maximum effect. But others had a rawness to them, a confused authenticity that resonated with my own experience. These people weren't trying to entertain or impress. They were trying to make sense of something that had shattered their understanding of the world. I found myself taking notes, compiling lists of common elements that appeared across multiple reports, the massive footprints, the eerie silence that preceded encounters, the sense of being watched and studied rather than threatened, the evidence of intelligence and curiosity, the escalating boldness over time. The pattern was consistent enough to suggest something real underlying the reports, but so extraordinary that accepting it required abandoning comfortable assumptions I'd held my entire life. What I found was both reassuring and deeply troubling. There were hundreds, perhaps thousands of similar reports from wilderness areas across North America. People describing encounters with large, intelligent bipedal creatures that showed remarkable curiosity about human activities. The consistency of the descriptions across different regions and time periods was striking. The creatures were always described as enormous, covered in fur, bipedal, and displaying intelligence far beyond what would be expected from any known animal. Many reports mentioned the same eerie silence I'd experienced, the same sensation of being watched and studied rather than simply threatened. What worried me most were the accounts of increasingly bold behavior. Many of the more recent reports described creatures that were no longer content to remain hidden and mysterious. They were approaching campsites, examining equipment, and in some cases, actively tracking and observing human visitors to their territories. The escalation pattern was clear and disturbing. Initial passive observation, followed by more direct investigation, followed by what could only be described as systematic surveillance. I began to wonder if my own activities had inadvertently triggered an escalation in their interest. Setting up trail cameras, camping overnight, repeatedly visiting the same area, I'd essentially announced my presence and demonstrated that I was trying to document them. Perhaps I'd crossed some invisible threshold that marked the difference between being tolerated and being seen as a threat or intrusion that required active monitoring. Over the following weeks, I tried to stay away from that area of the forest. I found other trails to hike, other clearings to photograph, other sections of wilderness that felt safer and less charged with menace. But I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd experienced and what it might mean, both for me personally and for anyone else who might wander into areas where they thought they were alone. The problem was that avoiding the area didn't seem to be enough. I started noticing signs that my nighttime visitors might not have been content to remain in their remote forest territory. Small things at first, easy to dismiss or explain away. Footprints in the soft earth around my apartment building after heavy rains. Positioned under my bedroom window. The sense of being watched when I took out my garbage after dark, subtle disturbances to the potted plants on my small balcony that suggested someone or something had been examining them. The first definitive proof came about a month after my camping experience. I woke up one morning and went to open my curtains, only to find handprints on the outside of my bedroom window. Large, distinctive handprints showing the same pattern I'd seen on my car and my trail cameras. The prints were positioned at a height that would have required something at least 8 feet tall to make them, and my apartment is on the second floor. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at those prints on the glass, my hand frozen on the curtain cord. My mind kept trying to generate explanations that would make the prints normal, innocent, explainable. Maybe a window washer had been by, and I'd forgotten. Maybe some kids had been playing a prank with oversized gloves. Maybe I was still asleep, and this was just a particularly vivid nightmare. But the prints were real. They were still there when I blinked, still there when I rubbed my eyes, still there when I pressed my own hand against the glass from the inside and confirmed that whoever or whatever had made them had hands nearly twice the size of mine. I called in sick to work that day. I couldn't face the normal routines of weighing animals and discussing vaccination schedules and pretending that my biggest concern was whether Mr. Patterson's elderly beagle was getting enough exercise. I spent the day in my apartment with all the blinds closed, jumping at every sound, unable to shake the image of something standing outside my window in the darkness, pressing its massive hands against the glass, looking in at me while I slept oblivious and vulnerable in my bed. The realization that one or more of these creatures had followed me from the forest, found where I lived, approached my building during the night, and looked through my bedroom window while I slept was terrifying beyond my ability to adequately describe. The safety and security of my own home had been compromised by something I didn't understand and couldn't predict or control. That day, I made a decision that went against everything I'd ever believed about myself as an outdoorswoman and nature photographer. I was going to end my involvement with whatever was happening in those mountains. No more trail cameras, no more camping trips, no more attempts to document or understand what I'd encountered. I was going to pack away my equipment, avoid those areas completely, and hope that my withdrawal would satisfy whatever intelligence was behind the escalating contact. But it seemed like my decision might have come too late. 2 days after finding the handprints on my window, I came home from work to find something waiting in the parking lot behind my building. The trail camera that had been stolen from the clearing, placed carefully on the hood of my car. The camera appeared undamaged, and when I checked the memory card, I found dozens of images that hadn't been there when it was taken. My hands shook so badly I could barely get the SD card into my laptop. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold beside me, clicking through image after image of places I'd never seen, perspectives I'd never considered, evidence of a journey that seemed to span miles of wilderness I might never have discovered on my own. Some of the photos were almost beautiful, in a strange and unsettling way. A waterfall cascading over moss-covered rocks, photographed from below in a way that suggested the camera had been held by something standing in the stream. A family of deer grazing in a meadow, captured from a hiding spot in thick undergrowth. The entrance to a cave much larger than the one near the clearing, photographed from inside, looking out at a view of distant mountains I couldn't identify. These images told a story of a world that existed parallel to the one I knew, a world where creatures moved through the wilderness with cameras they'd taken from curious photographers, documenting their own lives with stolen technology. The thought was both fascinating and horrifying. Most were shots of the forest from angles and locations I didn't recognize, suggesting the camera had been carried around extensively over the past weeks. Images of streams I'd never seen, rock formations I couldn't place, views of the canopy from ground level that showed the forest from perspectives no human photographer would typically capture. But the final images were the most disturbing. They showed my apartment building, my parking space, my balcony with its small collection of plants, my bedroom window, photographed from the outside at night when the lights were on and my silhouette would have been clearly visible through the curtains. The camera had been used to document a systematic surveillance of my living situation. The message was unmistakable. They knew where I lived. They had the intelligence and dexterity to operate complex electronic equipment, and they were informing me that my withdrawal from their territory hadn't ended their interest in me. That night, I heard sounds outside my apartment that confirmed my worst fears. Heavy footsteps moving around the parking lot below. Long pauses beneath my window, as if something was looking up and deciding whether to come closer. The creak of the wooden staircase that led to the building's second floor. Shuffling sounds in the hallway outside my door. The sounds continued until just before dawn, when they finally faded away. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat in my living room with every light blazing and the shotgun across my lap, listening to evidence that my life had been fundamentally and perhaps permanently changed by my curiosity about what was living in those remote forests. The next morning, I made the hardest decision I'd ever faced. I called my supervisor at the veterinary clinic and gave 2 weeks' notice. I contacted a realtor about putting my apartment on the market. I sold all my outdoor equipment, the cameras and camping gear and hiking boots that had been such central parts of my identity for most of my adult life. I began making plans to move somewhere far from forests and mountains, somewhere flat and urban and populated, somewhere that whatever had taken such interest in me would be unlikely or unwilling to follow. The conversations were difficult. My supervisor, Dr. Harrison, had been a mentor to me for years. She asked why I was leaving so suddenly, and I couldn't give her an honest answer. What could I say? That I'd photographed something impossible in the mountains? That it had followed me home and watched me sleep? That I was fleeing the region because I believed I was being stalked by creatures that weren't supposed to exist? I told her I needed a change, that I'd been offered a position in Ohio that was too good to pass up. She wished me well and said she was sorry to see me go. The lie tasted bitter in my mouth, but the truth would have tasted worse. Selling my equipment was harder than I'd expected. Each item carried memories of hikes and camping trips and perfect mornings spent photographing wildlife in places most people never see. The cameras that had captured so many beautiful images of deer and foxes and the occasional black bear that wasn't anything supernatural at all. The tent I'd slept in on dozens of perfect nights under star-filled skies. The boots that had carried me across hundreds of miles of mountain trails. I sold it all to a young couple who were just getting into outdoor photography. They were so excited, so full of the same enthusiasm I'd once felt. I wanted to warn them, to tell them to be careful, to suggest that maybe they should find a different hobby. But I just smiled and took their money and hoped they would never experience what I had experienced. It felt like surrender, and in many ways it was. But it also felt like the only rational response to a situation that had spiraled completely beyond my ability to understand or control. I'd stumbled into contact with something that operated by rules I didn't know. In territory I'd thought I understood, but clearly never had. For months after my move to Columbus, I remained vigilant for any signs that my departure hadn't been accepted. I watched for footprints around my new apartment, listened for sounds that didn't belong, checked my windows every morning for evidence of nighttime visits. Gradually, the signs of surveillance faded away, and I began to hope that my capitulation had satisfied whatever intelligence I'd been dealing with. It's been over a year now since my last definitive encounter, and I've started to feel like I might have successfully extracted myself from a situation that could have ended much worse than it did. I have a new job, a new apartment in a busy neighborhood where I'm never truly alone, a new life that has nothing to do with forests or wildlife or the wilderness I once loved so deeply. But I still don't venture into remote areas, and I still check my surroundings regularly for signs of visitors I wouldn't welcome. The experience changed my entire understanding of what might be living in the vast wilderness areas that still cover so much of this continent. There are places out there, remote and rarely visited, where things exist that most people would find impossible to believe. And some of those things are intelligent enough to understand when they're being watched and studied. Intelligent enough to turn the surveillance back on the watcher. I've never told this story to anyone before, partly because I know how it sounds. It's exactly the kind of account that gets people labeled as unstable or attention-seeking. The kind of story that makes friends look at you differently and co-workers whisper behind your back. But I've also never stopped thinking about what I experienced, and what it might mean for other people who venture into areas where they might not be as alone as they believe. The forests are still there, still vast and wild and ancient, still home to things that most people never encounter and never want to encounter. And somewhere in those remote clearings and hidden valleys, something is watching and waiting and demonstrating a level of intelligence that makes it far more dangerous than any bear or mountain lion. Not dangerous in the sense of physical violence, necessarily. Dangerous in the sense of curiosity, of patience, of the willingness to observe and learn and follow. I consider myself lucky to have escaped that situation with nothing more than sleepless nights and a fundamentally altered understanding of wilderness safety. But I also know that my curiosity almost cost me much more than that. I know now that there are places in this world where human beings are not the most intelligent observers, not the most patient watchers, not the apex anything. The trail cameras are gone, packed away in a storage unit I'll probably never visit. The camping gear went to a charity that outfits disadvantaged youth for outdoor experiences. The hiking boots that carried me through thousands of miles of mountain trails are sitting in a landfill somewhere. And the hunting seasons pass without me now. The autumn colors I once loved, fading from brilliant oranges and reds to the dull browns of winter, while I stay safe in my urban apartment and try not to think about what I left behind. But sometimes, especially on quiet nights when the city sounds fade away and I'm lying alone in the darkness, I still get that feeling. That prickling awareness on the back of my neck, that certainty that something out there is watching. And when that happens, I close my eyes tighter, pull the blankets closer, and remind myself that I made my choice. I chose safety over knowledge. I chose survival over understanding. I chose to walk away from a mystery that could have consumed me entirely. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Some questions should never be answered. And some things watching from the darkness are best left unwatched in return. I just wish I could stop wondering what they wanted, what they were trying to learn, what they might have done if I hadn't retreated when I did. These questions follow me through my days and haunt my nights, unanswerable and endless. The price I pay for a glimpse of something that was never meant to be seen. The woman I was before that autumn, the confident outdoors woman who thought she knew every secret those mountains held, she's gone now. In her place is someone more cautious, more aware, more respectful of the boundaries between the human world and the older, stranger world that exists alongside it, in places where the trees grow thick and the trails fade to nothing and the silence is never quite empty. I hope anyone who reads this will understand that I'm not telling this story to convince anyone of anything. I'm not trying to prove that Bigfoot is real or that the wilderness is full of monsters. I'm simply sharing what happened to me as accurately and honestly as I can remember it, because I think some experiences need to be recorded even when they can't be explained. And maybe, somewhere out there, someone else has seen what I saw. Someone else has felt that crawling awareness, heard those measured footsteps in the darkness, found those massive prints around their tent when morning finally came. Maybe they'll read this and know they're not crazy, not imagining things, not alone in their experience. Or maybe they'll be smarter than I was. Maybe they'll recognize the warning signs before things escalate, before the curiosity becomes mutual, before the watcher becomes the watched. Maybe they'll turn back while they still can, while the forest is still just a forest and the shadows are still just shadows and the silence is still just the natural quiet of wild places far from human activity. I hope so. I really, sincerely hope so. Because the alternative is finding out, as I did, that some of those shadows have substance, some of that silence has purpose, and some of those wild places are wilder than we ever imagined, home to intelligences that have been watching us far longer than we've been watching them. The mountains are patient, the forests keep their secrets, and somewhere out there, in clearings I'll never visit again, something remembers me. I have to believe that staying away is enough. I have to believe that my surrender was accepted, my withdrawal honored, my territory acknowledged as the small urban space I've claimed for myself, far from the trees and trails and wide open spaces where I once felt most alive. I have to believe these things because the alternative is too terrifying to contemplate. But late at night, when the doubts creep in and the shadows seem to move in ways they shouldn't, I find myself checking the windows anyway, just in case, just to be sure. Old habits die hard, and some fears never fade completely. The story ends here, but the wondering never does. I don't know what they were, or where they came from, or what they wanted. I don't know if they're still out there in those forests, watching the next curious photographer who ventures too far off the main trails. I don't know if they've already found others like me, people who asked too many questions and paid too high a price for the answers they almost received. All I know is what I experienced. All I can share is what I saw and heard and felt during those terrifying weeks when I realized that the wilderness I loved was also something to be feared. And all I can hope is that sharing this story serves some purpose, provides some warning, offers some small piece of knowledge to anyone who might be heading down the same path I traveled. Be careful out there. Pay attention to the silence. Trust the feeling when your instincts scream that you're being watched. And if you find massive footprints around your campsite, if your trail cameras start moving on their own, if the forest goes quiet in ways that feel deliberate rather than natural, walk away. Just walk away and don't look back. Because some things in this world are better left undiscovered. And some discoveries once made can never be unmade. I learned that lesson the hard way in the deep forests of the Allegheny Mountains during an autumn that changed everything I thought I knew about the world and my place in it. I survived, but survival came at a cost I'm still paying, and probably always will. The woman who used to hike those trails with confidence and joy, camera in hand and wonder in her heart, she's gone forever. And in her place is someone who flinches at shadows, who checks windows compulsively, who will never again feel completely safe in the world. That's the real price of knowing. Not the sleepless nights or the lost career or the apartment I had to abandon. It's the loss of innocence, the destruction of the comforting illusion that we understand the world we live in, that we know what's real and what isn't, that the boundaries between the known and the unknown are clearly marked and easily maintained. Those boundaries are thinner than most people realize, and on the other side of them, things are watching, learning, waiting. I know because I looked back, and something looked right back at me. Sometimes I wish I'd never set up that first camera. Sometimes I wish I'd ignored those strange tracks and those inexplicable claw marks and that eerie silence that should have warned me away. Sometimes I wish I'd been the kind of person who could see a mystery and let it stay a mystery, who could feel curiosity and choose not to pursue it. But I wasn't that person. I was someone who needed to know, who couldn't rest until questions were answered, who believed that understanding was always better than ignorance. I know better now. I know that some ignorance is protective, that some questions are dangerous, that some doors should stay firmly closed. But that knowledge came too late to save me from what I experienced. And now I carry it with me always, a weight that never quite lifts, a shadow that never quite fades. The forests are beautiful in autumn. I saw photos online the other day, golden leaves and misty mornings and the play of light through ancient trees. For a moment, just a moment, I felt a pull toward that beauty, a longing for the trails and clearings and quiet places I used to call my second home. Then I remembered, and the longing turned to something cold and tight in my chest, a knot of fear that will never completely untangle. I hope the forests are beautiful for other people. I hope other photographers and hikers and nature lovers can experience that beauty without ever encountering what I found. I hope the vast majority of wilderness visitors never see anything more unusual than a rare bird or an unexpected deer, never feel anything more unsettling than the ordinary solitude of wild places. But for me, those days are over. My boots will stay in the closet, my cameras will gather dust, and when autumn comes again, I'll stay in the city where I belong now, where it's safe, where I'm surrounded by people and noise and the comforting evidence of human civilization, where nothing watches me from the darkness except the memories that won't let go. Some prices are worth paying for safety, some losses are acceptable when the alternative is too terrible to face, and some stories need to be told, even when there's no satisfying ending, even when the teller can't explain what really happened, even when the truth sounds impossible. This is my story. Make of it what you will, But remember, the wilderness is not as empty as it appears. The silence is not always natural. And if you ever find yourself in a remote place, surrounded by forest, feeling that prickling awareness that something is watching you, trust that feeling, honor that instinct, and get out while you still can. I almost didn't. And I'll spend the rest of my life grateful that I finally listened to what the fear was trying to tell me. There are things in the woods that we're not supposed to see. I saw them, and now they know that I know. That's a truth I have to live with every day, every night, every time I close my eyes and see that figure in the pre-dawn light, crouched next to my tent, examining my sleeping bag with hands that were never meant to hold anything made by humans. Some truths change you forever. This one changed me. The end of this story is just the beginning of a different kind of existence, one where nothing feels quite safe anymore, one where every shadow might hold secrets, one where the line between the known world and something much older and stranger has been permanently blurred. I'm still here. I survived. I walked away. But I left something in those mountains that I'll never get back. My certainty, my confidence, my ability to look at a forest and see only trees. Now I see possibilities. Now I see hiding places and watching eyes and ancient things that existed long before us and will exist long after we're gone. Now I know. And knowing is the heaviest burden I've ever carried. This is my truth, my warning, my testament to experiences that most people will never have and should never seek. The forests are beautiful, the mountains are majestic, the wilderness calls to something deep in the human soul, some ancient longing for spaces untouched by civilization. But answer that call carefully. Tread those trails with awareness. And if the forest ever goes silent around you, if you ever feel eyes on your back in places where you thought you were alone, remember my story. Remember what happened to Margaret Chen, the wildlife photographer who asked too many questions about tracks she should have ignored, and then run and don't look back, because looking back is how they know you've seen them, and once they know that, they never stop watching, never. The woman who told you this story will be looking over her shoulder for the rest of her life. Don't let that be you. Please, don't let that be you.